If I told you that one of the bravest and most decorated enlisted aviators that fought in both World War I and World War II was an American, yet never once donned an American military uniform, would you believe me? Because you should, because we will be talking about Eugene Bullard. Eugene Jacques Bullard was born on 9 October 1895. His parental ancestors came from a line of slavery, and they were brought over to Georgia. In 1895, his father was actually working on a cotton plantation there. And if you can imagine life for a young African-American boy in 1895, in the early 1900s in Columbus, Georgia, it wasn't very promising for a young African-American boy. You know, there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity for a promising future. But Eugene Bullard was always driven off of the words of his father, who would talk about the country of France and how in France, if you were black, you'd be treated just the same as everybody else around you. And so that's what really enamored Eugene Bullard, and he was fascinated by that. So he set out to want to get to France, and by any means necessary, he wanted to get there. So if you can imagine, at the age of 11 years old, running away from home, that is exactly what Eugene Bullard did. He ran away from home at the age of 11 with the goal and intent to one day make it over to France, where his father had told him he could live a life of freedom. So he kind of bounced around the South for a few years, trying to make his way, trying to find a way to get over to France. It wasn't until 1912, he was 16 years old at this point in time, he gets to Newport News, Virginia. And in Newport News, Virginia, he boards a German merchant ship that was bound for Scotland. And he kind of stows away. So by the time anybody even realized he was on this vessel, they were well on their way. So during his time on this German merchant vessel, he picked up some German language, which would eventually help him later in life. But eventually he lands in Aberdeen, Scotland. And when he gets to Scotland, he very quickly after that becomes a prize fighter, a boxer. And his boxing career eventually takes him to England and then eventually to France, where he had always dreamed of living. And once he got to France, he made a home out of it. He fell in love with France. He was absolutely enamored by it and wanted to settle down and make a home there. Just a couple years after arriving in France, that's about the time that World War I kicked off. And here now, the things that the country that he so loved was under attack, and he wanted to do whatever he can to help the war effort. So he joined the French Foreign Legion, and he fought in combat. Matter of fact, Eugene Bullard fought in some of the worst battles in history of this world. The Battle of Verdun is where he actually earned the Croix de Guerre, which is one of France's highest possible honors that you can earn. And at the same battle, he becomes wounded twice in combat. And the second time he was wounded, he was actually found that he was unfit for infantry duty, but he wanted to continue serving his country that he loved so much. So during his time in the French Foreign Legion, he developed relationships that helped him get into the French Air Service. Now, when he found out about going to the French Air Service, he was very excited about this. He would tell friends, he had at this point in time, he had some pretty wealthy friends that he had met through his boxing career. And through conversation, he would talk about joining the French Air Service, and he dreamed of being a pilot. And then, of course, overhearing these conversations were naysayers that would hear this conversation. And those naysayers would say things like, they're not going to let you be a pilot because you're black, and there's no such thing as a black pilot. It's not done. Well, since Eugene Bullard had these wealthy friends, one of his friends made a bet on his friend. He made a $2,000 bet saying that Eugene Bullard would become a pilot. So the bet is made, and long story short, he does join the French Air Service. He very quickly after that gets accepted to pilot's training, and he does complete pilot's training, becoming the world's first African-American pilot, of course earning his friend the winning of that bet. But flies a little over 20 missions during World War I, actually has 2 unconfirmed shoot-downs, so highly decorated pilot at that. So in 1917, the United States entered the war, and he would have loved to have fought and flew for the United States, but again, racism backfired in his face, because when he applied to fly with the Americans, they didn't want to fly with him. They didn't trust him just because he was an African American, and they didn't want to fly with an African American. So that was denied, and then a couple years after that, he got into an altercation with a French officer, and he no longer flew again. In 1919, after World War I ended, he was discharged from the military, and of course lived out in France for several years after that. It wasn't until 1939 that he started making news again in France. At this point in time, he had already owned a gym, he had a nightclub in France, and at this point in time in 1939, the war was heating up, and this was World War II. And the French intelligence agency came to Eugene Bullard and they asked him if he would spy on the German patrons that would frequent his nightclub. Because here you had Eugene Bullard, who was fluent in English, German, and French, would have German patrons visiting his facility. And Germans at this point in time, a lot of them had a very racial mindset, thinking that black people couldn't speak multiple languages. Eugene Bullard was perfect for that job, so he acted as a spy for the early parts of World War II. Eventually, after Germany invaded France, he wanted to further help the war effort, so he again fought in battle in World War II for France as well, until eventually becoming wounded again. Eventually goes to Spain to get medical treatment and is brought back home to the New York area in 1940. In 1940, he gets his medical treatment and he lives out much of his life in New York. But if you can imagine this, here he was, one of France's most decorated war heroes, having served in both World War I, World War II, was the very first ever African-American pilot. But here he was living home in the United States, getting little to no credit for any of those things. He kind of did odd and end jobs, worked as a perfume salesman, worked as an elevator operator, but got very little credit for any of the things that he had done during both world wars. It wasn't until 1956 that France invited him back, and they wanted to invite him back so that he could help reignite the eternal flame at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers there in France. And of course, that's an extreme honor. He was only one of 3 people that were invited to do so. So he does that, and then a couple years after that, France awards him the Legion of Honor, a Knight of the Legion of Honor, which is literally the highest honor that you can earn as both a civilian or military member in France. So this is an incredible story of Eugene Bullard. Fought in 2 world wars, was the very first ever African-American pilot we had ever had. Yet, here in America, got little to no credit for it up until 1992 is when the United States Air Force decided to finally give him some of the recognition that he properly earned. So in 1994, the United States Air Force decided that they were going to posthumously award Eugene Bullard with the rank of 2nd lieutenant. And he unfortunately didn't live to see this. He passed away in 1961 from intestinal cancer. But that was really kind of the first time that the United States Air Force acknowledged what this incredible airman had done for not only our country, but for just the history of aviation.